Welcome back to Everyday Economics, the podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics, a production of America's Talking Network. You can subscribe to all of our podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording today's episode on Friday, January 12th, and joining me as always, my friend and partner, Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Dr. O, of course, you no longer live in the city of Chicago, and I believe that you're one of those folks that counts themselves lucky to be able to say that. Chicago is a terrific place. I mean, from the standpoint of architecture and history.
The arts and museum. I love the arts and museum. You know,
you can keep going. There's all kinds of things that you can be proud of.
And the lake there, it's just awesome.
What you can see and what you can taste and what you can touch, aside from bullets, of course, is pretty darn good.
That's right.
Underlying, economically, not so much. So you're working on a piece that's going to come out in the next edition of Cranes, where you're a columnist, Cranes Chicago Business. So just some data points to get us going, like really what's going on inside of Chicago. And you shared these with me. From November 2022 to November 2023, employment in the city of Chicago only grew by 0.8%, whereas the rest of the country, it grew 1.8%. So it grew at less than half the pace of the rest of the country. And the U.S. unemployment rate has remained fairly constant at 3.7% in the second half of 2023. And as we get into 2024, we'll get new numbers for January and February, of course. But Chicagoland's unemployment rate rose to 4.7% in November, and that was up from 3.9% in June. So there's something underlying going on inside the city of Chicago from an employment standpoint. And so what's the grip?
That's right. It covers the metropolitan area, the greater Chicagoland, right? And it's kind of frightening how fast Chicagoland is slowing in terms of its labor market. And you're right. You mentioned it. And not only, the unemployment is rising, it's not rising because you have a bigger increase in the labor force and people looking for jobs. You literally have a cooling. I mean, you have very steep decline in labor demand. And I know that because I looked at annual nominal wage growth. In the U.S., nominal wage growth is in the last month was 4.1%. In November, because that's what we can compare to. In Illinois, it was a sluggish 0.4%, basically flat, right? Lower than the rate of inflation. And for Chicago, the Chicago metro area, it had actually fallen. It fell over the past year by 1.97%. So you see wage growth still positive across the country, right? Positive, growing faster than the rate of inflation. Wage growth flat, 0.4% for the state of Illinois, slower than the rest of the country, lower than the rate of inflation. And in the Chicago metro, wages are actually falling over the past year by almost 2%. And that, to me, is a sign of trouble. You have a labor market in the Chicago market that has slowed tremendously, and you're now starting to see that basically you could have a contraction. Wage growth has slowed. Wage growth is not just slowed, it's fallen. You have, and yes, some positive stats. In November, Chicago just recovered all of the jobs lost during the pandemic, right? So we're back to where we were at the start of the pandemic. But, again, much slower than the rest of the country, right? So if you look at pre-pandemic job growth, we should be about 200,000 jobs higher than we are right now had the pandemic not even taken place. The rest of the country has done much better. Chicago remains very sluggish. And so I guess the big question is why? Why is Chicago lagging so much? Why is the labor market cooling so fast in the Chicago area? And I don't really have the answers to that, except I have to say that even if the Fed were to cut interest rates, right? The Chicago economy is at risk of contracting, could be one of those economies that cannot sidestep a recession. Especially if the Fed doesn't cut sooner rather than later. And again, there are major headwinds across the country, but the headwinds are probably stronger for Chicago. And one of those headwinds I want to add is probably the rising number of commercial real estate properties that are teetering on the edge, right, on the brink of default. I think that's going to pose a significant threat nationwide, but especially for Chicago, because Chicago happens to have one of the most significant shortfalls in office and retail occupancy rates.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that recently. Just to be, completely straightforward with you, I have not been in the city since just before Christmas. So I'd say almost maybe a month ago. But, I do spend a fair amount of time in the city of Chicago. And it's just not the same. Years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, on the Illinois in Focus podcast, which is also available here at America's Talking Network, when I was on that program with Dan McCaleb, I had warned, I said, these mitigations, these decisions that are being made about the in-person work and kids going to school and things like that, and businesses being shuttered and mandated closed. And I said that just this simply, because I'm not an economist and I don't pretend to be an economist. And I love the fact that I get to ask you questions, frankly, that are kind of dumb questions from an average person. But I said this. I said, it's not like a switch. It's not like a light switch. You cannot flip the economy off and turn the economy back on. And I think that not only are businesses gone in the city of Chicago that aren't coming back, but the ritualistic approach that we've had to work in person, I think that's also gone, and maybe gone for good. And cities like Chicago that rely on corporate headquarters, where larger groups of people come together to in theory, to do work together, I think it's really, really, really going to suffer more so than maybe some other markets, because there is so much consolidation of that kind of office space usage in the city of Chicago. And I just don't see that coming back. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of appeal among businesses, in putting offices into Chicago right now, because they don't want to deal with what's going on in the city. They don't want to deal with the crime. They don't want to deal with the migrant crisis that the city's had. We've had 32,000 people come here since August of 2022. And, it is just not the environment. I started by saying it is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and that is a fact. That is an absolute fact. But it's just been so disastrously operated to a greater degree through the Lori Lightfoot era and now in the Brandon Johnson era. It's just not appealing. If you owned a publicly traded company, or even if you owned a startup, and even if they seeded you to start in Chicago, I think you'd fight every urge to do that, to actually bring something to the city of Chicago for all of the reasons that I've just laid out.
Well, and you know better than me because you live in the area, and you've probably seen a lot of these corporate giants leaving the city of Chicago and relocating out of state, taking a lot of some of their workers with them, but just not there anymore, leaving these buildings empty or half empty. And of course, right, the value of these properties has fallen tremendously. A lot of these commercial real estate properties are sitting around on negative equity, and there's not a lot of buyers out there for these properties. And I think that's the scary part. And then, of course, in March of this year, you're gonna have on the primary election ballot, right, this new real estate transfer tax. The real estate transfer tax is going to change the structure of the real estate tax, right? Transfer tax. But at the same time, it will basically, it's a tax hike, right? It's going to be a tax hike on commercial and industrial expensive property, which is, it's not just mentions. Yeah. It'd be nice if it was just mentions, but it's not just mentions. It's also commercial and industrial property that tend to be a little bit more on the expensive end, right? So that could actually prevent the flow of buyers to some of this distressed commercial sector in the Chicago area. Of course, supporters of the tax increase are saying that this is going to help the city combat homelessness. But ultimately, if you look at office occupancy rates and the disproportionately high distress in commercial property loan in Chicago, the heightened tax burden could further depress property valuations and elevate the risk of delinquency and default. And so the jury is still out on this one, but it's risky business, in my opinion. I think going forward in an environment where the economy is slowing so fast, it's important for policy leaders in the city and across the region to be a little bit more careful about the types of policy proposals they're putting out there.
I think it's well said. We'll call it good right there. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.